Noah Rivera's hands smelled of talc and coffee, and for a long time those two scents were the honest things in his life. The warm bitterness of mornings at the diner 2 doors down, and the clean, powder-dry smell of the shop that had been his father's before it was his. He kept a razor in a wooden box behind the counter, not the modern ceramic cutters most barbers use now, but a heavy, straight-edge blade with a dark wooden handle worn smooth by years of touch. It was his father's razor. It was his only razor. People in his block swore it had a temper. Noah liked to think of it as memory given a blade. He had no illusions about the city's appetites, only obligations. Pay the rent, get his mother the medication she needed, keep the barber chair warm for the regulars who came because the shop smelled like home. He never expected that a single gesture, handing his razor to a man who could erase him with a phone call, would rearrange everything he thought he knew. The first time Vittorio Santoro wandered into Noah's shop, it was on a wet Tuesday in late October. The city had the hollowed sound of rain that night, tires shushing, a distant ambulance keening like an animal that couldn't find its way home. Vittorio didn't need a haircut. His hair was cropped close, the way men who never wanted an enemy wore it, but he needed presence, and Noah's little window offered him a stage. He smelled of citrus and old money, of cologne that suggested an imported life. His hands were steady when he tipped the barber's chair back. He didn't fidget, which was a nervous habit Noah had thought reserved for the poor and persistent. He tapped his watch, a heavy gold piece with a face like a coin, and smiled an economy of a smile. The medallion on a thin gold chain lay hidden beneath his shirt, but when he adjusted his collar, Noah caught the glint. The watch was the first motif Noah registered. The man watched Noah with a certain curiosity, and Noah, who'd learned to read people by the line of their jaw, the way a knuckle whitened, saw no immediate threat. He saw power learning a small town's language. "I like this place," Vittorio said, voice flat and smooth like glass warmed by sunlight. "Reminds me of something I used to have." Noah could have said the city had stolen that something and left only shell, but he said instead, "We keep it honest." He trimmed the man's temple, the razor gliding near the skin with a sound like a promise kept. Vittorio closed his eyes and let the snips and the quiet do the work of unburdening. When Noah finished, he set the blade in its box and found himself watching the man in a way that had little to do with hair. Men who carried power were often tender in private ways. They took care of small things with the same gravity they used for big ones. Later, no one would be surprised Vittorio had brought Noah a gift, because that's how favors were paid and loyalty measured in their city. The gift was a watch, not the cheap kind the shop sold for tourists, but a wristwatch in a velvet box, heavy and new and gleaming. Vittorio said it was for a man's good hands, but the way he placed it in Noah's palm felt less like charity and more like an offer. "Keep it for luck." The watch was the second motif Noah filed away, a round, perfect counterpoint to the razor's blunt honesty. "Don't let this get you in trouble, kid," Vittorio told him quietly, like a parent warning a child away from a stove that had already scorched another. "People notice things," Noah laughed. He kept the watch in a drawer at the shop, under a stack of appointment cards, where it caught light when the afternoon sun angled in and looked like the small coin of some impossible future. It was the kind of thing you touch when you're thinking, like a worry stone for men who could not pray. The small reveal arrived within a week. The man who swept up the shop, Manny, found a ring on the floor behind the back chair and slid it into Noah's pocket before closing up for the night. It was a heavy signet, not expensive in a way anyone who knew jewelry could name, but old, worn at the edges like it had been in someone's pocket for years. Noah pocketed it because he loved objects with a past, and because he didn't know who else to give it to. The ring was the third motif. Then the first crack. Someone came in late one night and slashed the shop's window with a knife, a message etched into reflections and glass. One long, careless scratch that spelled a threat you could not argue with. Noah found the phrase on a napkin taped to the door the next morning. "Keep hands where I can see them." It was small and stupid in the way things meant to terrify always were, like the person who wrote it thought terror could be stamped on paper and left on a doormat. Noah tightened the shutter and called his cousin, Angel, who ran security at a nearby warehouse. and had a way of glowering that suggested he kept the city's wolves from finding the corner where Noah's mother kept her life. "You think they're messing with you?" Angel asked. Noah said he didn't know. He kept the razor in a different drawer that night, wrapped in a towel that smelled of lavender and old cash register oil. Micro cliffhanger. Noah would later learn that the knife was not random. But the city knew how to whisper. Violence was never random. It was arranged like flowers for a funeral. 2 nights later, the streets sang differently. The city had the heat of a coming storm, and Noah closed up with the heavy metal door he still liked to roll by hand, because the motion steadied him. As he pulled the door down, he saw Vittorio's car idling at the curb, lights off, like a great beast waiting to be petted. Vittorio stepped out, wet from rain, and paused under the shop's awning as if the drip line had significance. "You still have it?" he asked. Noah felt suddenly ridiculous. "Have what?" "The razor," Vittorio said. "Your father's razor. The one you keep like it's some kind of talisman." Noah's mouth went dry. He had told nobody about the razor's box. It was the last thing in his life that belonged to his father in the way that possession holds memory. He thought of the wooden grain, the weight of the blade, its nick where a year-long liney of hair had been, and the way he'd honed it in the shop light when he couldn't sleep. He felt the pull between keeping it and honoring the man who wanted it. Vittorio's presence reshaped the air. "I don't give that away," Noah started to say, then stopped because there was a look in Vittorio's eyes, not pleading but precise, that made Noah consider other things. Vittorio didn't ask in the usual way. He extended his hands like a man making a pact. "I want to keep it safe," he said. "From the wrong hands." It was a strange request, one that fumbled at the corner of what Noah thought he knew. "Give my father's razor to a man whose hands could be the last hands you saw." Noah surprised himself when he opened the wooden box and passed the razor over. It felt obscene and sacramental at once, the cool metal lighting the skin of his palm like a confession. Vittorio closed the box carefully and slid it into the lining of his coat. "Keep my watch," he said, "until we need to trade it back." Noah swallowed. He kept the ring in his pocket, and the medallion, a small, faded photograph in a locket his mother wore, hung at his chest under the shop apron. He had the photograph in his mind, a young boy with his father's chin, smiling too bravely for a picture. The photograph would become the fourth motif, the small image that could tilt truth into ruin. The small reveal came quietly 2 days later. Noah was sweeping clippings when a car pulled up with lights blazing, and men with the look of broken loyalty spilled into the street. They were not the kind of men who paid for trims. They were the kind who paid with permanence. Vittorio's name was a hush in the neighborhood that evening. Someone had tried to kill him. Rumor moved faster than the ambulance. Someone had shot at his car on the FDR. A bullet had gone through glass and into a seat, tearing fabric like a scream. Noah watched the television in the corner of the shop show a grainy clip. A black sedan, a burst of light, Vittorio's car smoking on the wet road. The hospital would make a relay of it. Vittorio did not die. He could not be killed and survive in the way men like him survived, by being partly myth, partly ledger, partly threat. He ended up stabilized and furious, swaddled in machines with the gold watch still on his wrist like a crown. Noah went to the hospital before he allowed himself to refuse. He took the subway and the smell of things that weren't home, bleach, antiseptic, the iron tang of worry, and found Vittorio in a private room that smelled faintly of lemon and leather. There were 2 men, like shadows pinned to the doorway. They watched Noah as if his permission might be needed to enter. Vittorio's face had a bruise forming along the cheekbone, and his eyes burned with the look of a man who keeps count. "You gave it to me," he rasped when Noah stood at the foot of the bed, "and they still shot at me." Noah felt a lurching guilt. He had given the razor because he'd thought himself generous, stupid, a man performing an act of simple human kindness to someone who could pay rent for a month with a handshake. He had no idea that handing over an object could act like a map. Vittorio's hand found Noah's and squeezed it in a way that meant both thanks and ownership. "You did the right thing," he said. "For now." The hospital scene was more than plastic chairs and the smell of disinfectant. It was where power bared itself in small confessions, and where Noah learned how dangerous charm could be. Vittorio's anger came like thunder. He wanted the people who had tried to kill him found and taught lessons. He wanted names. Noah found himself answering questions he had not been asked, laying out the list of men he had seen in the neighborhood with a specificity that felt like a demonstration. The FBI's name came up as a thing you said in the presence of high stakes. Federal interest, a thing that turned private vendettas into bureaucratic storms. Noah had once argued with his mother that some men deserved the state's weight. Now he learned that when the state leaned in, it did not always pick sides with the vulnerable. Vittorio had resources. Noah had a chair and a childhood memory, and that worn photograph under his mother's blouse. And for reasons he would later understand poorly or perfectly, he kept turning toward the tide. The medium reveal emerged through a ledger. Noah found it by accident, or perhaps the city wanted him to find it and had left the instrument in the place of least suspicion. Manny's locker. Manny found a hidden envelope in the back of a supply box, wedged between Barber capes, and delivered it to Noah with a theatrical cough, as if the paper itself were poisonous. It was a folded set of pages, numbers and names written in a meticulous hand, lines of payments and recipients, dates that stitched the city's private economy into a document you could hold. Noah thought at first it was bookkeeping for some kind of contractor, but then he saw the names. There were names of men who had disappeared, names associated with land deals and union bribes, names annotated with pressures and asterisks and tiny hearts that meant protect. The ledger smelled of dust and tobacco and the kind of ink that doesn't like daylight. He took the ledger to Angel, who read the pages like a man who'd been waiting to read the future in someone else's accounting. "This links him to everything," Angel said, voice low. He tapped a line where a payment corresponded to a land acquisition across the river. "If this goes public, people go to jail." The ledger was the fourth motif. No, the ledger was the pivot. It changed things by the weight of its ink, the way a tide changes a shoreline. Noah understood he had holding in his hands a map to both salvation and destruction. A medium cliffhanger. Noah would learn that the ledger named his father. Noah could feel his world tilt, the way an old chair tips when a leg gives. He found pages with his father's name scrawled in the same looping script he'd seen in a marriage license box back on the bookshelf at home. The name sat there like a smudge, Salvador Rivera. Someone had written beside it a date, and then, in smaller letters, a shorthand note that could mean anything from loan to favor. Noah went home and held the small photograph his mother kept in the locket to the light. The boy in the photograph looked like him. The ledger's ink had integrity. It suggested his father had once not been only a barber. It suggested his father had been the kind of man who kept accounts with men whose faces the city recognized on posters and who could buy silence like a commodity. Noah took the ledger to the precinct. Police stations have a smell, coffee gone cold, paper glued to desks, the metallic sheen of tired fluorescent lights, and a procedure. They logged the discovery with a careful kind of suspicion that felt like a warning. A detective named Ellis read the pages and tapped the ledger as if it were a vein he'd just uncovered. "This is federal," he said. "You gave this to the wrong people." "Wrong people?" Noah asked, because he hadn't thought of Vittorio as wrong. He'd thought of him as a man with a set of rules. Noah was learning the difference between rules and ownership. Detective Ellis leaned back. "If Vittorio's men get wind of this, it won't be pretty," he said. "If the feds get involved, it could be messy in a different way. You need to be careful." Noah watched the detective leave, the ledger heavy in his hands, and thought of the medallion his mother wore, a locket that, if opened, contained a picture of a man with a mustache and eyes like lead. He thought of the razor in Vittorio's coat. He thought of the watch ticking in his drawer at home. His life had become a room full of objects that now felt like evidence. Then came the ambush, a sequence of action that unfolded like poor choreography for the desperate. Noah was closing late when the lights in the street went out like somebody had cut the city's breath. He heard the slam of a car door and the smell of gasoline, and then, short, fast, the sound of boots running. Shapes moved like oil shadows against the alley brick. A man lunged at Noah. Another hit him from the side. They were not interested in the ledger then. They wanted something that belonged to Noah in a way he had not considered. His freedom. They wanted the photograph he kept in the back of his till because it tied someone to someone else. Noah's jaw met a fist, and the taste of metal filled his mouth. A voice he could have sworn was angels cut through the night, orders sharp and desperate. A woman screamed once, a sound that made Noah's bones remember a childhood fear, and then the sound of a shotgun being racked in a warehouse down the block rolled through like a god. Noah woke up in the alley with his head ringing and his fingers sticky with something that might have been blood, might have been jam from a sandwich. The watch on his wrist was gone. The ring was gone. The ledger had been taken. He pulled himself up by the storefront and found a note slipped under the door in a handwriting he recognized only as a language of threats. Leave it alone. The ambush was not an accident. It concluded with the implicit message that the city's map now had fewer squares for him to stand in. He went to the hospital, this time not for Vittorio but for himself. The emergency room smelled like old upholstery and antiseptic, machines hissing. A nurse named Priya stitched his forehead with the efficient tenderness of people who sew up strangers for a living. She chatted about the city's weather, a bit of small talk to distract from the pain as she worked. Noah's hand found the photograph in his jacket, creased but intact. The photograph had always been a talisman, and now it felt like a lit fuse. The hospital scene showed him small, vulnerable, stitched and conscious of every inch of himself, as if he'd been made of glass. He watched a blip on a monitor and thought about the ledger and his father's name, about Vittorio's watch and the signet ring and the medallion in his mother's drawer. Objects were becoming the grammar the city used to talk about what belonged to whom. The interrogation scene arrived the next morning at the precinct, when Detective Ellis sat Noah across a metal table and tapped the ledger like a prompt. "You keep this, you become a target," Ellis said. "You bring this into the open, you could upend a lot of people's lives, including your own families." Noah thought of his mother, of her slow steps and the way she counted pills into a cup like she was trying to manage time. "My father," he started. Ellis's face softened for a moment. "Who was he, kid?" "A barber," Noah said. "A man who owed favors. Maybe he was more than that, but he was a good man to me." Ellis leaned forward, the light catching the lines at his eyes. "Sometimes being good doesn't mean you're safe." He recited what Noah had to have known. That betrayal often started in small things and grew into the kind of thing that needed arrest. "If Vittorio thinks this ledger is a threat," he let the sentence hang. Noah's mouth went dry. He had to own the ledger's existence, the fact that he had handed it to the precinct. He had to own everything. "I don't know who else to trust," he said. It was the line of someone who had been raised to believe in institutions that sometimes failed. Ellis's next words landed like a blow. "There's already someone on your father's file," he said. "A woman who says she is related to your father. She says she wants to be tested." Noah felt the floor slip. DNA. The mid-story twist felt like it was arranged in the cells of his own blood. There was an implication the ledger might not only name his father, but that hidden filial ties could connect him to a man like Vittorio. A ledger could show accounted favors. DNA could show accounted blood. Noah had always thought of his father as someone small and steady, a man whose biggest crime was a missing rent check, but the ledger suggested a wider orbit. The woman's name, Elena Morty, appeared in Ellis's file like an accusation or a lifeline depending on who read it. "No," Noah said. "No, that can't be right." "You're not the only one who thinks that," Ellis said, and then, "We can do the test. If you're related, it changes how this plays." Noah stepped out into the chill and looked at the small medallion his mother pressed to her chest like a heart. If DNA could reframe his life, then what would he choose to do with it? Would he bring the ledger to daylight, the way detectives liked? Or guard it like a relic and trust that loyalty could survive in the dark? The interrogation revealed that the ledger might tie him to Vittorio in a way that made him both a threat and kin. The smaller reveal, that his father's name was in ink, unfurled into the medium. The ledger was more than bookkeeping. Another micro cliffhanger. Noah would have to decide whether to look for blood ties or burn the book. Noah didn't decide in a public way. He made a private pilgrimage to his mother's apartment, which smelled of rosemary and old books, and found her sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone cold. She opened the locket for him and let him touch the photograph. "You carry his genes and his debts," she said softly. There was a tremor in her voice that suggested her heart wasn't only fragile but in a ledger somewhere. "But you also carry choices." That night, someone came to the shop with an index finger dipped in malice. A man smelled of cheap cologne and desperation, knocked on Noah's door, and asked for a favor. He wanted Noah to use his father's favorite razor for a special job, to shave a man who was to be humiliated. Noah refused because it was beneath him, and because he had the kind of pride that rehearsal had taught him. He locked the door. The man left with a threat spoken like a promise. "Your father's hands will be remembered," he said, and left like a shadow. Noah woke to the sound of his apartment being broken into. People talk about the noise of tigers, a kind of silence that announces something dreadful, and when he opened his bedroom door, his heart thudded hard enough to bruise the air. Someone had rifled his drawers and left the locket open on his pillow. His mother's medallion lay on the floor like a pearl spilled, the photograph missing. Noah realized with a cold, precise panic that someone was assembling parts of his life like a puzzle with an urgent deadline. The missing photograph was the next microbeat that would pull him toward a public and private unraveling. He called Angel, who told him to disappear for a while. Noah moved through the city like a man shedding his skin. He slept on a friend's couch, he ate sandwiches from bodegas at 3 in the morning, and he avoided known routes. The watch Vittorio had given him had been taken, the ring disappeared, the ledger stolen. The motifs were being unwound like thread from a spool. Noah had less than he began with, and the city felt like a hand closing. The Game Changer reveal hit in the church basement, where prayers and paperwork sometimes walked the same line. Elena Morty stepped out of a shadow and into the pool of light Noah's flashlight made. She was older than he imagined, with hair streaked in gray and a look that suggested she'd watched monsters age and thought about ways to live with them. "You're Noah Rivera?" she asked. Her voice was like a file opening. She had a folder in her hand, and when she set it on the table, Noah could see the neat print of hospital records and a photograph pinned on top. A boy who looked startlingly like Noah, standing next to a man with Vittorio's jawline. The photograph was obviously newer than the lockets. It had a credit from a civic event, a politician shaking hands with men who told the city how to behave. "You knew my father?" Noah asked. Elena smiled a sad, thin smile. "I knew him as Salvator. He saved my father's life once. He worked for people who could pay in favors. He claimed to do good. The ledger says he did business with Santoro. The DNA shows." She left the sentence open by placing a folder on the table that contained a copy of a DNA test result. It was official, stamped, clinical. The probability shown in the printout read like a verdict. Noah's knees went soft. The probability suggested he and Vittorio were connected by blood. The air in the church basement seemed thinner, as if the ceiling had been lowered by the truth itself. Noah felt the solid ground of his past dissolve into a documentary of mistakes, ledger lines, that led back to a man he had casually given his father's razor to. The Game Changer altered everything. A ledger had connected names on paper, but the DNA had connected blood. Noah felt both lucky and betrayed by the sequence. He went to a mirror and looked at his face, at the slope of the nose he shared with the man in the hospital photo, and for the first time considered how much of himself was inherited. The watch on his wrist, gone, could have been a symbol of kinship. The razor in Vittorio's coat could have been a bloodline's bargaining chip. The photograph, the medallion, the ring, the ledger, and the watch had woven together the map of a man who had been small, and then perhaps larger than Noah ever imagined. Then came the ambush that changed who Noah would become. Men moved like weather. They struck not in corners but in the daylight, in alleys with trash cans and unlit cameras. Noah was picked up one morning and shoved into a van with no windows, the smell of rubber and stale bodies and fear thick as a soup. A driver with hands like pumpkins drove for hours, the city unrolling behind them like a bad dream. They took Noah to a warehouse on the piers where the river tasted of wire and industry. Chains clinked. The men were impatient, their eyes flinty under harsh lights. They wanted the ledger. They wanted the watch. They wanted the photograph. It was there, under a skylight with a single bulb that hummed, that Noah saw Vittorio step forward. He wasn't in a suit. He was in a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a man who had been up all night relearning the angles of his face by flashlight. He had the razor in his hand. The blade gleamed like a promise. He could have used it to cut, to call for fury. He didn't. He stood in the open like a man expecting the sky to speak. "Why'd you give it to him?" Vittorio asked, and his voice did not belong to any melody Noah knew. It was sharper, like a scalpel. Noah's mouth went dry. "I didn't think." "Not your father's razor," Vittorio said. "My barber's boy, my blood, you give away the tool I keep for my own rituals. You don't know what you touched." Noah had wanted to refuse, to stand and say no, but he felt the weight of a city squeezing. "I gave it to you because you asked," he said. "Because I thought it would keep you safe." The men around them shifted, and Noah felt the cold of the blade close to his throat as a demonstration. Vittorio's face was not monstrous when he lost control. It was human and cracked with grief. "They tried to kill me," he said suddenly, voice raw. "They fired into my car because they thought I was vulnerable. They thought they could scare me. They don't understand what family means to me." His hand tightened on the razor, and his knuckles blanched white. The scene around him snapped into focus. A ring on a man's finger caught the light. A watch on a wrist glinted. The motifs were arranged like props on a stage. Vittorio's blow-up was not to kill, but to unmask. Tears came bright and abrupt to his eyes, and for a moment Noah saw a man who had been stripped of the armor he wore. He wept, not for himself, but for a life that had been built by numbers and silence. The men who'd come to the warehouse stared, their hardness interrupted by something like pity. The emotional unmasking was a breach, a reminder that even men who asked for favors and bought loyalty were, under it all, people with regrets. Then one of the captors shoved the ledger at Noah and said, "The book. Where did you hide it?" Noah met Vittorio's gaze, a question and a danger. He could hand over the ledger and perhaps buy his freedom, or he could keep it hidden and risk that the men would cut every tether from his life. He did the last thing they expected. He stood up with a stubbornness that felt older than fear. He reached for the razor in Vittorio's hand, the one he had once given him, and held it there like an offering. "You don't have to do this," Noah said, voice steady in a way that surprised him. "You can walk away. You can get out of this and not put me in the middle." Vittorio laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Walk away from what? From who I am?" He slammed the razor down on the table with a force that made the bulb above them shudder. "Everything I've built is a life. You think you can step into that life and not get anything on your hands?" Noah's palms were suddenly clammy. "Maybe I don't want anything on my hands," he said simply. "Maybe this ledger doesn't belong to you. Maybe it belongs to all the people you think you bought." For a long heartbeat, the air held its breath. Then one of the captors, a man with a scar like a line of bad luck, reached for the ledger and found nothing. Noah had hidden it up his sleeve before he'd left, a foolish, heroic thing. He tore at the sleeve. The ledger slid free and landed on the wooden floor like a confession. Vittorio's men lunged, but Vittorio, oddly protective even now, positioned himself over the book as if to shield it from shame or to claim it as a father claims a child's secret. For a moment Noah saw the man as thoroughly human and dangerous, loving and afraid, and the contradiction undid him. The ambush fizzled into a standoff when law enforcement, tipped by Detective Ellis and Angel working a shadowed flank, crashed into the warehouse in a choreography of blue lights and shouted commands. Shots rang like punctuation. Men fled, people were grabbed. Noah, for all his fear, felt a surge of something like lightness when he saw officers cuff a man he'd once thought invincible walk down into the night. Yet the ledger, in the confusion, was smacked into the grip of an agent who looked at it with the kind of hunger Noah had seen in Vittorio's face. The raid led to headlines. Barber's ledger REVALS ties to SANTORO, the paper said in a font that loved scandal. Cameras flashed. The city wanted names. It wanted tidings. In the press, Vittorio's name was a coin flipped in public. The public payoff arrived as prosecutors lined up against a network that had once been an invisible belt of favors. Men who'd thought themselves permanent found themselves in courtrooms where the state made art of meticulous cruelty. Noah watched the city change like pages turning. But public resolution is not the same thing as personal redemption. The ledger's appearance in the light meant men were indicted. It meant the law had teeth. But it also meant Vittorio seemed smaller, not because the man had been diminished, but because the life he'd built was being examined under fluorescent truth. Noah found himself pulled into testimony rooms where his voice was measured, where the watchful faces of jurors and agents found him both a witness and a subject. He told the truth as best he could, that his father had made choices, and that the ledger had been an account of favors exchanged. He was careful to say his father was not the vilest thing, because the man in the photograph on his mother's locket deserved that mercy. He kept the specifics to the facts, because truth had a way of becoming a weapon if tossed. The interrogation where betrayal was revealed came at a vantage he had not expected. It was Manny who betrayed him, but not for money. Manny sat across from him in a room full of stale coffee and fluorescent light, with a look of someone who had had to choose between his skin and Noah's. "They put a gun in my kid's mouth," Manny said, voice small. "I did what I had to do." Noah's chest constricted. The betrayal felt like an old scar reopened. Manny had handed over the ledger at the warehouse because he'd been threatened. He had tried to save his son by buying his safety. Noah forgave him in a way that felt less like mercy and more like agreement. The city had taught them all to barter with the currency of fear. The interrogation exposed the human calculus beneath treachery, and Noah's grief was not for legal abstract, but for collateral souls. Then the courtroom drama. Vittorio's trial was the city's drama played on law's stage. The ledger, the watch, the ring, the photograph, the medallion, each a little witness, were brought forward, laid on tables under blue lights like sacrament. Vittorio sat in a suit the color of a storm and did not look like a man who feared conviction. He looked like a man watching how many people he could take with him. When proof surfaced that his men had killed on contracts, the city called it justice. But a man like Vittorio had friends who were politicians and men who kept their silence the way others kept faith. The legal resolution was as thorough and messy as any public reckoning. Indictments, plea deals, a trial that bled for months. In the middle of it, Noah's mother collapsed from stress-induced illness and ended up in a hospital room where the machines hummed like a chorus and nurses walked with the urgency of people trained to catch life from slipping. Noah sat by her bed and touched the medallion at her throat like a talisman. He considered the ledger and the fact that the documents that had cost so much had also bought something, a chance for some forms of justice. But it also cost him his sense of privacy and peace. The hospital had been a required beat. It became an altar of decision. Noah watched his mother breathe and felt the shift inside himself that would lead to standing up to Vittorio. The final vault of confrontation came in a public hearing where Vittorio, in a rare unguarded moment, lost measure. He stood in the courtroom and watched as names he had protected were called, and the ledger's pages were read aloud like scripture. The emotional unmasking was cinematic. Vittorio's shoulders sagged, and for a breathless second the mobbed man who never showed cracks crumpled like paper. He began to speak, not like a man making the usual threats, but with a voice that trembled because something inside had been revealed to be weak. His father had left him with a debt that wasn't just monetary. He had inherited a need that had been passed down like disease, and the ledger had become, suddenly, a mirror. Noah met Vittorio's eyes across the courtroom and felt the complicated thing that came when two men bound by blood and choice observed one another. The man had tried to buy Noah's life once with a watch. Noah had refused to be bought. "You keep telling people what family is," Noah said later, when he was finally afforded a private moment in a sterile hallway outside the courtroom and Vittorio, escorted by plainclothes officers, stopped to speak. "You say family is everything, but you make family into contract. You make everything into leverage." Vittorio's face was a map of slow revelations. He looked exhausted. "And what would you have me be?" he asked. "The man who lets others pick at what he's built." Noah stood taller than he felt. He had the photograph in his hand, the one he'd hidden for months inside a shoebox, and he turned it between his fingers. "I would have you be a man who lets his sons choose their lives," Noah said. "You are not my father. My father was a barber who had regrets. He loved me. If you think legacy is a ledger you can pass on, you are wrong." Vittorio flinched as if Noah had flicked him. The men around him looked at Noah like he was reckless and naive, and Noah understood the danger. "You don't get to lecture me on anything," Vittorio said, hurt like a weapon. "Then stop asking me to be something I didn't sign up for," Noah said. And there it was, the moment when the protagonist stood up to the Mafia boss not with a blade but with a thing worse in their world: moral refusal. No one shot. No one died. The public payoff, indictments and plea bargains that set long fingers toward justice, had been achieved outside of personal satisfaction. The ledger had done its work. There was more at stake than law. The personal transformation Noah underwent was quiet and stubborn. He started by returning to his shop. He replaced the broken window with one he paid for himself. He sent his mother to a rehab clinic while she recovered and promised himself to learn the small hum of the city's good. He kept the photograph in a box now, not for the secrets it revealed, but for the fact that it was proof he had been loved. Vittorio's sentence was a thing of public record. Several years for racketeering and obstructing justice, reduced for cooperation. The city turned the man into a cautionary tale, and for some, a martyr. Noah watched from the back row of the courtroom for the day the judge read the sentence, the gavel like final punctuation. He thought about the razor he'd given him and the watch he'd been given in exchange for silence. He thought about Manny's betrayal and Angel's savior moves and Detective Ellis's weary kindness. He thought about Alina Morty, who had come into the church basement and given him the truth that would change everything. He thought about the 5 motifs that had been the physical currency of the story. The medallion that held his mother's heart, the ledger that recorded lives in ink, the photograph that tethered him to a man he'd never known, the watch that had been a token of favor and then a token of loss, and the ring that had been found and vanished. Each had been introduced as an object and later tied to a reveal. The medallion opened to show a picture that hinted at origin. The ledger revealed ties. The photograph was proof that connected him to blood. The watch became evidence and symbol. The ring led to betrayal. They were the breadcrumbs the city used to tell its tale. In the public finale, Noah chose, almost rebelliously, to refuse notoriety. Reporters wanted him to sit on panels, to recount the harrowing moments. He declined interviews. He preferred a life of small trades and steady hands. In the epilogue-style close, he returned to the shop and bought a different razor at an antique store. Not his father's, but something with a lineage that wasn't tied to men of power, something ordinary and honest. He sharpened it carefully and placed it in the wooden box that had once held his father's blade, and he kept it there as a ritual rather than an offering. The watch that Vittorio had given him, the one he had once worn and then lost, he replaced with a plain timepiece under his own name. The ring returned to him years later, slipped into his apron pocket by Manny, who had served time and come back like a repentant saint, and it felt different now. An emblem of human failure rather than a token of threat. Noah's mother recovered slowly. She smiled more often and counted pills with a careful diligence that suggested new purpose. Alina Morty and Noah corresponded over time, their letters a patchwork of olive branches and practical assistance. Detective Ellis retired eventually and sent Noah a postcard of a beach with a short note: "Keep cutting." Angel moved into a security business with honest clients. The city did not become a sanctuary overnight. It kept its appetites. But in small ways, Noah had shifted it. He hired an apprentice to show him the rhythms of hair and conversation. He taught the boy how to hold a razor like a story, not a weapon. Vittorio's loss of control in court had not been the end of him as a person, but a beginning of a reckoning. He died years later in a prison infirmary, a man who had been softened by time and by the small cruelties of confinement. Noah attended the funeral on a gray day, not because he forgave him completely, but because in the half-light he could see the shape of a man who had once reached for his razor like a talisman and been betrayed by the very currency he had thought would protect him. Noah left a medallion at the gravesite, not his mother's but a simple coin with no engraving, as an acknowledgement that history is both inventory and memory. The city kept its music. Sirens, subways, the click of heels on wet pavement. Noah cut hair with a calm he had once thought impossible in a life touched by ledger and blood. He married a woman who taught school and who reminded him that ordinary days can be love's greatest proof. They had a child with his father's nose and a laugh that made the shop feel like sunlight. He kept the photograph hidden in a drawer and took it out on the nights when he wanted to remember why he had chosen to stand. He kept the ledger's photocopies in a locked box that he would one day donate to a historian who loved to tell the story of how small men made big decisions. The motifs medallion, ledger, photograph, watch, ring lived in stories he told his son when the boy asked where the scars in the city's skin came from. He told the truth in measured doses because the truth was both weapon and medicine. Years later, when the city would ask its children what had happened that autumn, the season that had tilted a barber into the dangerous company of men who measure life by favors, they would answer in fragments. They would talk about the barber who gave away a razor. They would always start with the blade. They would end with Noah's hands, which kept steady even when the city's appetite wanted more. The final lesson Noah taught in his little shop, the one he whispered to the apprentice as he closed each day, was simple and honest. Some things are worth holding onto, not because they make you powerful, but because they remind you who you are. He ran the razor down the edge of a whetstone and looked at the reflection in its mirror sheen. He saw the man he had been and the man he had chosen to be, and for once the city felt like it had obeyed the rules of human kindness. In the end, justice arrived in law and in a quieter form in the days when Noah's mother laughed again, and the little boy with his father's nose learned to say Barber like it was a prayer. The ledger had done its work in public. The boy's life had been spared the worst of the city's appetite for children of its sins. Vittorio's fall had been not a neat redemption, but a complicated unmasking that left both loss and space for change. Noah kept the new razor in its box, and when the night was late and the shop was empty except for his own breathing, he would take out the watch Vittorio had given him one last time, now polished and repaired, and set it on the counter as a reminder of how close he had come to being purchased. He would turn the watch over in his hand and smile, small and private, because a man who has held both ledger and blood can still choose the way he measures time. And sometimes, when the rain started again and the city smelled of wet newspapers and diesel, Noah would stand at the door and watch Vittorio's old car, now a memory, now a cautionary tale in the city's museum of mistakes, pass by. He'd touch the wooden box where his father's blade had once lived and think about the day he'd handed a razor to a man whose life had been a contract. He'd think about the ledger, the photograph, the medallion, the watch, the ring, and how each had been a small doorway into a wider story. He had given his razor away because he wanted to believe that a simple favor could keep someone alive. He had learned the cost. He had also learned that even after bargains and betrayals, there was room to choose a life that wasn't written in other people's ledgers. He closed the shop with his hand over the wood of the drawer and walked home to a kitchen that smelled of garlic and the small sounds of family. In the morning, he would wake and sharpen another blade and cut hair for those who needed it. And the city's appetite would keep the same rhythm, and Noah would keep his hands honest. Noah never stopped noticing the little things the city offered up. A pair of gloves dropped on a stoop, the way sunlight carved an angle across an old sign, the exact sound a subway made when it was running late in winter. Those were the things that stitched days to one another and made him feel like living was something you could practice. He taught his son to hold a comb the way his father had taught him. Light, patient, not like a weapon but like an instrument. The boy laughed when his hair tickled his ears. The laugh was a small, precise geography of joy that made the shop feel like it had always meant to be a home. There was a day, years after the ledger had gone public, and the slow legal wheels had scraped into something resembling closure, when Noah locked the shop early and walked along the river. The air tasted of iron and sugar and summer rain still clinging to the concrete. He took the medallion out of his pocket and turned it over between two fingers. It was dented now, the photograph inside bleached a little at the edges like an old page. He thought about the hands that had once held it, his mother's, shaking sometimes but steady when it mattered. And he felt something like gratitude for the way that small piece of metal had kept memory safe when other things had been stolen. He found Manny sitting on the bench outside the bakery, a man who had paid the price, and then come back the way tired people come back to their small towns, quieter, plenty contrite, a little older in a way that took the sharpness from him. Manny's face had the map of time on it, and the ring he once pocketed had returned one late afternoon, folded into a napkin like a confession. Manny offered no excuses he didn't need to make. He offered instead the small acts that mend, fixing the back sign on the shop, sweeping the stoop on mornings when Noah had to be at the hospital. They didn't speak much about the warehouse anymore. It had become one of those bad rooms in memory where everyone gave only what they could afford. Elena Morty came to the shop once in autumn, the kind of day where the sky looked like thin paper and the city smelled of chestnuts and distant fairy oil. She had brought a loaf of bread and a folder of letters about restitution and how the families of small men who had vanished were getting something the law couldn't always make whole. She and Noah talked about shifting things small and practical. Scholarships for kids whose fathers disappeared, community meetings to help people learn how to keep themselves from being swallowed. She had that look again, a tough tenderness. And when she left, she pressed her hand to Noah's shoulder like a benediction. Detective Ellis sent him a Christmas card one year, a photograph of a shoreline and a single line written in a hand that had lost some of its bluntness. "Keep cutting," he had written, the same joke he'd penned before retiring. The card meant something like relief. The agent had not thought the ledger would be enough to topple everything. He had not been wrong to be cautious. But the ledger had done what ink can. It told a story that enough people read and acted upon. Justice in any form is messy, and this one had not been clean, but it had been real, and Noah accepted its imperfections the way you accept a weathered coat. The watch reappeared one spring, tucked into a shoebox near the back of the shop with a note that was only 2 words. "Forgive Emmy." Angel had left it. He had been part of the complicated calculus that had kept Noah alive during the worst of it, and now he seemed older and less interested in the kinds of power that measured men by how much they could bend others. The watch's tick was softer than Noah remembered. He wore it only once to his son's kindergarten graduation and then put it back in the box. It was history now, not a currency. There was another kind of currency Noah found harder to spend: reputation. People in the neighborhood began to speak of him differently. Mothers who once whispered about the barber shop being in a bad part of town started bringing their daughters for trims. A councilwoman who had once avoided the block turned up at a local fundraiser, thanked Noah publicly for the community classes he organized, and later apologized in private for the months when she had looked the other way. Noah accepted gestures because he had learned the city's complicated ways. Sometimes redemption is stitched into the modest acts of ordinary days. A year after the court, Noah decided to teach a class on barbering at the community center. He taught more than technique. He taught how to hold conversations that could ease strangers and heal small griefs, how to listen like people matter. His students were men and women who wanted work that did not demand that they sell a piece of themselves. He told the story of the 5 objects once, in fragments, when asked about the things that had changed him: the medallion, the ledger, the photograph, the watch, the ring. He spoke of them as reminders rather than relics. He watched the young faces in the room and felt the particular blessing of passing down craft rather than contract. On a winter evening with the city wearing fog like a cape, he stood at the sink in the back of the shop polishing the new razor he had bought at an antique market. The one he had decided to keep, because it represented a deliberate, clean line. A tool used for its intended purpose, not for leverage. The metal smelled like cold and promise. He thought of his father, and for the first time in a long time the memory didn't come wrapped in questions that cut through him. It was a memory like the sound of scissors in the afternoon, predictable and sure. The photograph stayed in his drawer, but it no longer tightened his chest like a fist. It loosened, like a knot that had finally given way. There were nights he still dreamt of Vittorio, but the dreams were strange and humanizing, not monster-making. He imagined the older man's face, soft in the unthreatening blue of dawn, and wondered whether the ledger had freed Vittorio by making him face what he had built. Perhaps the confession of power is its own kind of liberation. The man had been a father of sorts and a tyrant at once. History had folded him into both categories so that his name would be part scolding and part cautionary tale. Noah stopped wanting the sound of the razor to be a weapon in any life. He wanted it to be an instrument to make people look like themselves again. At home, his mother planted basil in the window box and insisted he eat more than sandwiches. His son learned to count by identifying different combs. "One wide, two thin," the boy would say. They had their rituals now. Saturday mornings at the diner after the barber's first appointments, an extra cup of coffee for Noah, pancakes for the boy. The ledger's photocopies were tucked away in a bank deposit box where an archivist could one day make a proper study of them. They were useful to history, Noah thought, and dangerous to juvenile ideals about heroes. Years gave him perspective, but not indulgence. He still had the best pocket knife he would ever own, the one his father had left in the back of the bottom drawer, which he used to open letters and packages. Its metal had a familiar warmth. He used it to open a small envelope one afternoon that held a single photograph, a new one of the funeral at the prison. Vittorio's face was softer, older, diminished by time and regret. Noah folded the picture back into the envelope and set it on the windowsill where the light hit it and made it into something like a lesson. In the small happiness that followed, he did the unromantic work of life. He paid taxes on time, he taught an apprentice to greet customers by their names, and he learned to say his father's name aloud sometimes in the kitchen when he thought nobody was listening. Salvator. The name felt good in his mouth. He read the little notes his mother left him on the fridge, and once found a receipt folded in the book of appointments for a donation to a scholarship she had contributed to, a small, anonymous gesture that spelled something like forgiveness across a city. On the last day of his old life, in a way, Noah sat in his empty shop after closing and took the wooden box down from the shelf. He set the razor he'd bought on a clean towel and breathed in the smell of metal and oil and a life he had not expected to keep. Outside, a street vendor flipped through the packets of a late supper, and a car idled with a man who had one more stop to make before returning to a life someone else could know nothing about. Noah thought of choices. He thought of blood and books and the many small ways people measured one another. He set the medallion near the razor, then the photograph, then the watch and the ring, the 5 objects that had once been currency. For a long time, he just looked at them. He did not need to reclaim what had been taken. He needed only to decide who he would be when the next storm came. He chose the most ordinary thing: to keep cutting hair for people who needed to look like themselves again. He placed the razor back into the wooden box where his fathers had lived and closed the lid like someone tucking in a child. The sound was soft. It was a promise. The city would always be hungry for something. That was not a surprise. But he had learned and taught and taken small measures to make it less hungry where he lived. He had taken a ledger that tried to record everything and made sure it recorded what mattered. That small people could choose big things, and that families could be remade by acts of care more often than by bloodlines or ledgers. He walked to the door and turned the sign to closed, and the street smelled like rain. He walked home to the soft argument of his mother and the laugh of his son, and for once he slept without the ledger's shadow crossing his dreams. Years down the line, his son would sit in the same chair Noah had sat in as a boy, and ask for a cut in the exact tone his father used with regulars. Noah would look at the child's face, the echo of a father's nose and a mother's smile, and feel the unutterable gratitude of a man who had been through fire and returned to an ordinary life that felt like victory. He would tell the boy the smallest truths he knew. Be steady, keep your hands honest, and hold on to the things that prove people have been kind to you. He would tell him, too, the story of the 5 objects, not as an epic or a warning, but as a ledger of the soul. Take care of your things, because they remember who you are. The razor rested quietly in the drawer when he sleepily checked on it one late night, its edge bright as a thin moon. He ran his thumb along the wood and found a soft place worn by years of touch. The city hummed beyond the window. Noah turned the key in the door and walked toward a life that was quieter and fuller, and he hoped, kinder. He had been given and had given away things that could buy silence and power. He had chosen, in the end, to buy back ordinary days. He would teach his son to tell that story too, not as legend, but as a way to keep memory honest. He would remind him that razors cut, that ledger's list, that photographs hold proof, that watches measure time and choices, and that rings can bind or free. He would remind him that whatever debts you inherit, you can still choose what you will repay with. Some nights, when the rain came down hard and the reflection of the neon sign wavered in puddles, Noah stood at the doorway and watched the city move. He touched the medallion at his chest and felt the faint outline of his father's laugh in the metal. He smiled a private smile and closed the shop with a quiet hand. In the morning, he would open it again and keep cutting, and the city would keep turning. And in the small, stubborn currency of kindness, another life would be made steady by one man's simple, honest trade. To hold a blade and make something whole.